Good morning and welcome to the 12th meeting in 2014 of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. And appropriately today we are in the Adam Smith room where I believe Robert first met with the committee some years ago. Can I just remind everyone present to please turn off their mobile phones, tablets or other electronic devices. Our first item of business this morning is to decide whether to take items 3 and 4 in private, and whether to take further consideration of our draft Stage 1 report on the Revenue Scotland and Tax Powers Bill in private at future meetings. Are members agreed? Members have indicated their agreement. Our second item of business is to take evidence of the UK economic and fiscal outlook. I welcome to the meeting Robert Choate, Chairman of the Office for Budget Responsibility. And Mr Choate will begin with a short opening statement.
Thank you very much indeed, Convener. Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be back. Thank you very much for asking me. Let me open up just with a few remarks on how the forecasts that we produced at the time of the budget have moved since previous forecasts, both in terms of the economy and the public finances. And maybe I should then say something about how the forecast for the public finances over the next 5 years, what that is implying for the change in the sort of shape and structure of the state and relative to the pre-crisis period. So you get a sense of what the aggregate movement is over the crisis period and the consolidation period in which we're embarked at the moment. But to start off on the economy, compared to the forecast that we produced back in December, by the time we got to the budget, it was clear that there was a bit more momentum in economic growth coming into 2014 than we had anticipated. The growth number for the first quarter of 2014 was actually the same as we predicted back in December, but there had been upward revisions to previous GDP data for 2013 suggesting that there had been more of a pickup in the economy during 2013 following a period of relative stagnation in 2012 and earlier. So we've elevated our growth forecast for this year slightly up to 2.7% growth over the previous year. That was in line with the average of outside forecasts at the time that we made it, and the outside average has now nudged up another 0.1 in the wake of subsequent data. In terms of the economy growing a bit more quickly than we had anticipated a few months previously, I guess the main reason for that was that consumer spending had performed slightly more strongly, and notably that seemed to be as a result of people drawing down savings more quickly than we'd anticipated, rather than the long-awaited pickup in real income growth, which is important for the long-term sustainability of the recovery. So our forecast assumes that there will be a slight slowing in the quarter-on-quarter pace of growth through this year, simply as consumer spending moves rather, more back into line with the underlying growth in incomes, rather than assuming a continued rapid fall in the proportion of people's incomes that are being saved, which you wouldn't expect to see continuing at the sort of rates that it has been over 2013. So we have a slightly lower growth rate in 2015 than we do in 2014. The way the arithmetic worked, that's not a forecast that we're expecting the economy to run into choppy waters into 2015. It's the fact that you have this slight slowing during the course of this year that we anticipate, as I say, as consumer spending moves back more into line with income growth. If you look out over the 5-year horizon, we're expecting the economy to grow by about 2.5% over a year over this period. Consumer spending, needless to say, an important driver of that. It always is. It's the largest share of spending in the economy by some margin. We have a pickup in business investment. The numbers there have been revised up, showing stronger growth in business investment through 2013 than we had anticipated at the time of the previous forecast. What we don't have is any additional contribution to growth over the next 5 years from net exports. So we're not relying on an additional improvement in net trade performance in order to deliver this growth pattern over the 5 years. It's much more down to consumer spending and the pickup in business investment. Government spending cuts act as a drag over the 5-year period. We've been surprised there that they haven't acted as more of a drag already, partly because of the way the output of the public sector is measured, but we're expecting that to be more the case looking forward. As I say, these forecasts are not a million miles away from the outside average. The Bank of England slightly more optimistic about the pace of growth during the course of this year. They're expecting 3% plus. That's partly because the bank, in addition to forecasting what's going to happen in the future, forecasts how the Office for National Statistics will revise past history, which we don't try to do. But the main reasons for the bank being more optimistic, they expect a swifter pickup in business investment than we do, and slightly more consumer spending activity as well. So that's broadly the picture there. We think that there's a little bit less spare capacity in the economy than we thought back in December. That seems to fit with us, with the fact that unemployment fell rather more rapidly in the early part of this year than we'd anticipated, suggesting that some spare capacity was used up. But as ever, there is enormous uncertainty over any estimate of how much spare capacity there is in the economy at any given time. If I turn on to the public finances, the borrowing looks as have come out, and the official data will have been published 5 minutes ago, so I don't know what the outturn data is for the latest set of numbers, but it will be there now. The forecast that we were producing was suggesting a pretty similar picture to the one that we had back at the end of last year. Slightly lower borrowing than we were anticipating then, partly because of stamp duty coming in more strongly because of the activity in the housing market, partly because lower inflation than we had anticipated reduces the cost of reduces the cost of servicing index-linked gilts. We're expecting the budget deficit to continue to shrink year in, year out over the next 5 years. That's primarily because of the ongoing cuts in public expenditure as a share of GDP. And I think if you look at over this whole period and go back to the pre-crisis period, it's worth doing a brief contrast of where our forecasts now imply on current policy that the government will be in 2018-19 at the end of our 5-year forecast, and compare that to where we were prior to the financial crisis, say in 2007-8. By 2018-19, we're expecting the overall budget to be back in balance, essentially speaking, for roughly the first time in 18 years. At that stage, you would have both taxation and spending at about 38% of national income, which is not a million miles away from where they were the last time we were in a position of near budget balance early in Labour's term in office in the UK back in the early 2000s. If you think about how we get to that period of balance and compare it to where we were in 2007-08 prior to the financial crisis, there are some striking comparisons. The first of which is that we were running a budget deficit back in 2007-08. In the run-up to the financial crisis, the budget deficit had been about 2 to 3% a year over that period. The forecasts imply that the government wants to get rid of that budget deficit. So it's got to find 2 to 3% of GDP from somewhere. At the same time, we know that in 2018-19 we're going to have to spend a bit more on debt interest than we were back in 2007-8 because the amount of borrowing that's been going on in the meantime. So you've got to find a bit more money for that. The welfare bill, social security spending as a share of GDP, you would expect to be slightly higher in 2018-19 than it was back in 2007-08. That's partly because retail price inflation has been relatively high over this period, so the generosity of many social security payments has risen relative to the living standards of people in work and to the size of the economy. So you've got to find a bit more money for that. The government's not planning to raise a great deal more tax revenue than it was back in 2007-08. So how do you get all of this to add up? The answer is by a continued squeeze on public expenditure. That's where the bulk of the continued work on fiscal consolidation over the next few years is coming from. Capital spending will be a bit lower in 2018-19 than in 2007-08, but the government's indicated that it doesn't want to squeeze that too much further. So the real squeeze is coming on the day-to-day, non-investment running costs of the public services. And on one measure, it's hard to have a long historical comparison here, but that's heading as a share of national income to levels that we haven't seen at least since 1948. So if you're trying to close a budget deficit, spend a bit more on welfare, spend a bit more on debt interest, not raise very much more in tax, to get all of that to add up, it's this squeeze on the day-to-day running costs of public services that gets you to that endpoint. So I hope that's of some use as an introduction.
Absolutely. I mean, I had intended to ask you a whole series of questions, which, since you've spoken, I've decided I'm going to ask you a whole series of different questions. Colleagues will be pleased it won't be a whole series of questions, because always I like to ensure that they have an opportunity to ask questions rather than me steal all the kind of juicy ones at the start of the session, which I always try not to do. I mean, just on the last point that you made there, is it true, in your view, that about 80% of the fiscal consolidation will be through reduction in public spending?
Yes, that's about right. I mean, it depends on precisely what counterfactual you're using, i.e. what would you have expected to happen in the absence of policy changes. But yes, the government's basically aimed for an 80-20 split through most of the consolidation plans that it's laid out, and it still looks pretty much like that. And that's effectively taking tax receipts back to where they were prior to the crisis and reducing spending sufficiently not only to get rid of the increase in spending that took place during the crisis, but then also to get rid of the budget deficit that you had back in 2007-08. So take the two of those together, and you're right, it's roughly 80-20. In terms of timing, it's striking that most of the tax increase component of that has happened already. It's the increase in VAT, standard rate of VAT is the main element of that. So you've had most of the tax. You've had most of the cut in capital spending, which, as I say, is what leaves you with the squeeze on public services spending as being where most of the remaining lifting is to come.
Okay, I'm sure colleagues will probably want to explore that further. I mean, you talked about the levels of economic growth, etc. I take it we're now more or less back to trend growth, but there doesn't seem to be any catching up, so to speak, for the years of lost output, because obviously the economy shrank by over 5% at the peak of the recession. The IFS have advised that the real incomes won't reach 2001 levels till 2017-18. Is that about right?
I think that's roughly where we're showing it, and that's what you would expect. Partly, you need to take into account the pace of economic growth, but also you've had an increase in the size of the population over this period. So the comparison in terms of GDP per capita, which is quite closely linked to real living standards, not precisely so, similarly looks weaker in comparison. So in that sense, we're further away from reaching the crisis peak than we would be if you didn't take into account population.
Yes, indeed. So if the economy is growing at 2 or 3% a year and the population is growing at 1 or 2% a year, you're only talking about real 1% per capita growth. I mean, one of the themes, actually, in fact, in the overview in your executive summary, you talk about is the outlook for productivity growth, which underpins income growth and sustainability recovery, remains the key uncertainty. I mean, I understand this is something that economists have been trying to wrestle with over the last few years, why productivity hasn't really grown more. Usually, obviously, in recessions, you know, the unemployment increases, but per capita output increases, obviously, and that doesn't seem to have happened as has happened in normal recessions. I wonder if one of the reasons for that is the fact that the employment growth that we've seen, and you talk about in paragraph 124, a lot of it's kind of tends to be kind of part-time work rather than actual full-time employment. I mean, you know, in terms of jobs, where are we in terms of full-time equivalents, if you like, rather than just the number of people who are in employment?
There's an element of that, but I think the key point to bear in mind is that the productivity puzzle is still a puzzle if you look at output per hour as well as output per worker. So that allows you to take into account those two things. So the fact that there remains a puzzle that, you know, there is a growing number of hours being worked in or until relatively recently, a growing number of hours worked in the economy to produce not a great deal more is the underlying puzzle. And that obviously is adjusting for the degree to which self-employment and part-time employment and short-time working is an element there. So it helps to explain part of the big picture, but it doesn't help get rid of the underlying puzzle, which is not merely why did the private sector create so many jobs when output wasn't going anywhere, but why even were there more hours being worked over the same period without a great deal more output being produced.
I mean, you talk about, you know, in your report actually about income growth for people who are self-employed actually hasn't really matched expectations, which is why tax receipts from them are lower than expected. Is there an element of the fact that because wages have risen less than inflation, then relative labour costs have been lower than, for example, investing in further capital. We hear about how businesses are often capital rich, that's had an impact on productivity.
Again, some people would run a story that says, the relative, cost of labour and capital and the substitution between the two would be a part of the story. I think most people's view, again, is that, it's hard to run that argument strongly enough for it to explain a great deal of the difference. I mean, one other explanation, I'd love to say that we've cracked this since last time we were here, but nobody has. But I think one explanation to which people continue to come back and still in most people's minds has validity is this idea that the difficulties of the financial system, credit conditions, the wider difficulties of the financial system means that capital hasn't been reallocated as efficiently as would normally be the case from relatively unproductive firms that might normally go out of business to younger, potentially innovative, potentially highly productive firms that you would ordinarily hope to be growing quite rapidly. Some people, when you look at that story, would emphasise the zombie firm side of it, i.e. the failure to kill off the weaker firms, a combination of the fact that wages are relatively subdued, interest costs relatively subdued, banks not wanting to crystallise losses, so firms keeping going. Perhaps more important, though, is this perhaps inability of potentially rapidly expanding, productive, innovative firms to, for example, get hold of the working capital they need to do that. But it's hard to precisely quantify the contributions of all these things. And one must therefore assume that it's a combination of a lot of them. Another issue which we may have more light shed upon in the summer is whether output is being undermeasured. So if you look at the 1990s recession and recovery, subsequent statistical revisions have made the recession look shorter and shallower and the recovery stronger than the earlier vintages of national accounts data suggested. So, for example, if you think back in the 1990s, 3 years after the pre-recession peak, people thought at the time that the economy was running about 2% below that peak. If you look at the national accounts data today, they suggest that it's at the same point, we now think output was running 2% above the peak. And a 4 percentage point difference is quite substantial as a revision compared to the size of the fall in GDP during the course of the recession. Now, we have no way of knowing whether that will be repeated and that we will see new data showing that this recession has been shorter and shallower than the previous ones, but it's clearly a possibility given what happened in the 1990s. And what's striking in the 1990s is it took some years for the statisticians to change the numbers in such a way that it really sort of rewrote history in a noticeable fashion. So we may get some of that in this summer. We have quite a big set of national accounts revisions coming up, which will have, we may come on to this, quite big impact on measured public debt. It will make the cash size of the economy look about 2.5% to 5% bigger than the current data suggest it will do, but it's less clear how that will affect the path of real GDP down and up during the course of the crisis. But I mean, it just always brings you back to the sobering fact that we are dealing with the relatively early drafts of economic history here, and anybody who says my forecasts are great may find that history confounds them, and the people who are very depressed about it may suddenly discover they weren't as dumb as they thought they were.
Where do you think we are in terms of the structural level of unemployment in the UK relative to pre-recession levels?
Well, our view, and this is one that we share with the Bank of England, is that, and this is obviously highly uncertain, but that the long-term sustainable level of unemployment, the level consistent with stable inflation, may be about 5%, 5.5% or thereabouts. At the moment, unemployment is about 7%, a little bit below 7%. The Bank of England has what it thinks of as a medium-term sustainable level of unemployment of around 6%, on the basis that if unemployment falls rapidly to that, maybe then you would expect wage growth to pick up. Because we're looking over a 5-year horizon, they're looking over a 2 to 3 year horizon, we focus more on a longer-term view of structural unemployment, so assuming, for example, that some of the long-term unemployment that is automatically associated with any rise in the jobless total, that those people are re-employable in time, it takes time, and that therefore you can probably sustain 5.5% unemployment in the long term. So that implies that we have got some spare capacity remaining in the labour market, and it's one of the reasons why we still have an output gap, a view that the economy is running about 1.7% below its full potential, because there is scope for employment to be higher than it currently is, consistent with maintaining the inflation target in the longer term.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, obviously, you've prepared a briefing on Scotland specifically, particularly in terms of the devolved taxes. So I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions on that before I open up to colleagues around the table. And the first one really is about the OBR's forecast figures for the Scottish rate of income tax. I mean, if we actually look at the OBR's figures, March 2012, it's a prediction that in 2016-17 that would be 5.633 billion, in fact. But your latest prediction from March of this year is that will be 4.974 billion, which is a drop of 659 million, or almost 12%. But at the same time, in December 2013, you predicted that Scottish rate of income tax forecasts would increase from 4.377 billion to 5.551 billion, an increase of 1,174 million, or 27%, in the 4 years from 2014-15 to 2018-19. I'm just wondering if you can kind of talk us through those revisions and where we are now.
Sure. If you think about it at two levels, about what the UK position is as a whole and then the Scottish share. If you're looking at the UK position as a whole, I mean, one of the striking features of the recovery to date has been the fact that earnings growth has has not picked up as rapidly as we had anticipated that it would do, and that's linked very closely to the productivity puzzle. You would assume that once productivity starts to increase, that will make firms more confident about paying people more, and that you would get back to the sort of world in which you see earnings growing more rapidly than inflation. That hasn't happened as quickly as we and most other forecasters anticipated, so that would explain over time some of downward revisions to the overall level of income tax receipts. The picture from year to year is also complicated by the changes in the tax rate, in the top tax rates, so introduction of 50p, introduction of 45p. The fact that both of those changes were pre-announced created incentives for those people who were in a position to shift their income either forward or backward in time in order to take advantage of the change in income tax rates. That's made assessing what the underlying path of self-assessed income growth has been particularly difficult, which has clouded quite a lot of this. If you're looking over, why you would expect things to pick up in the future, we are assuming that, productivity will eventually start to pick up, that you will start to see incomes growing more rapidly than inflation. There's some evidence that the gap has now closed. It's early days, but we're assuming that that starts to happen during the course of this year, and that in time you get back to a more typical pattern of seeing incomes rise by 2% or also above inflation. We don't get to that by the end of the 5 years, but you're moving in that sort of direction. And that will then bring back something that we haven't seen for quite some while, which is fiscal drag. The idea that as incomes outpace inflation, you see more people being pulled, more of the incomes of more people being pulled into higher tax brackets, raising the average tax rate, and that helps to bring the overall receipts higher moving ahead. In terms of the Scottish share specifically, I think one key point to note is that we now have, which we had for this forecast, which we didn't have for previous ones, the survey of personal incomes for 2011-12, which is at the moment all we have to go on in terms of working out what the Scottish share is up until the point at which the HMRC actually flags people as being a Scottish taxpayer or not a Scottish taxpayer, and that suggested that the Scottish share was higher in 2011-12 than the previous forecast had suggested, so we've adjusted for that and pushed it through the forecast. We are a bit more optimistic about earnings growth in this forecast than we were back in December, so that pushes things up a bit. You've also had the impact of the budget measures, which is not enormous in terms of their impact on the Scottish share, but the key elements are that you have a further rise in the personal allowance, that tends to be, something that impacts Scotland relatively more than the rest of the UK. On the other hand, some of the measures in terms of dealing with tax avoidance and getting payments up there, you would expect to affect Scotland less than the rest of the UK. So there are pros and cons in terms of the impact of budget measures on the Scottish share, but that's relatively small compared to the underlying adjustments to the UK forecast as a whole, which I think are more important in terms of tracking both where the revisions have been and also why you expect to be getting more in 5 years' time than you do today.
Yeah, I mean, there's real issues in terms of block grant adjustment. And one last point I want to go into is land buildings transaction tax, so that colleagues have a chance to ask questions also. And that's basically, there's been a significant reduction in terms of Scotland's share of land buildings transaction tax, or stamp duty, land tax it is now, of course, from 6.7% of the UK to 4.1% over the last 5 years. Now, the Cabinet Secretary has suggested that there should be a kind of an average of those 5 years should basically fuel the block grant adjustment. But the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Danny Alexander, has said that the value of a one-off adjustment would erode over time and therefore cause a windfall gain to the Scottish Government and windfall loss to the UK taxpayers over quite a number of years. Now, in terms of the OBR's forecast, LBTT, your latest forecast is a doubling of Scottish land tax forecasts from 283 million to 580 million, in fact, an increase of more than 100%. However, the committee said in its stage 1 inquiry on the LBTT bill that, and I quote, the OBR forecast were wildly optimistic, some £127 million more than was in actuality. And again, you go on to say that, while London has increased by 12.3% in house prices in 2013, there was only a 0.5% increase in Scotland. So I realise that's a fairly long-winded question, but the bottom line is that I think, and I'm sure other members have the same view, that we have real concerns about the OBR's forecasting in terms of LBTT receipts, given the history of that particular issue. I'm just wondering if you can talk us through that a wee bit.
Yes, well, I can understand the concern. I think you should have concern about anybody's forecast for a property transactions tax. I mean, the one important thing to remember here is that in terms of predicting what you're going to get out of this, you're not simply interested in house prices, but also the volume of transactions as well. And so one of the reasons why you get much bigger swings in the amount of receipts you get from these sorts of taxes relative to, say, income tax or VAT, is that you've got both the uncertainty about where the prices are going, but also the uncertainty about where the transactions are going. Transactions are relatively depressed compared to what you might think of as the long-term sustainable level. That in itself is uncertain, but you basically have to go back to some view of, on average, people move house X times or once every X years, and that implies a level of transactions, and you assume over time you get back to that. Go back 2 or 3 years, and certainly we would have been anticipating the economy picking up, and therefore the activity in the housing market and the consequent receipts from that picking up more rapidly, because there is a greater volatility on the way up and on the way down. That didn't happen. But, of course, it has now started to happen with a vengeance, and one of the reasons why we will end up, I presume, borrowing less this year than we'd anticipated previously is that now the housing market is more buoyant than we'd anticipated, rather than being less buoyant than we had anticipated. In terms of the Scottish share, the additional uncertainty, of course, is to what extent the increase in receipts, the dramatic increase in receipts we're seeing at the moment, is a London effect, or perhaps more accurately, an expensive houses effect. And it's just that there are more expensive houses in London relative to the rest of the country than elsewhere. So it's not clear it's actually a regional issue per se, as distinct from a house price distribution issue. We've assumed that London, or the top end of the market, continues to outperform relative to the rest over the next year or so, and that's been taken into account in the Scottish share forecast that we've produced. So I'd love to say we're now going to be moving to a period in which the stamp duty receipts suddenly become vastly more predictable. I think that would be a rash thing to promise, but at the moment you've got a combination of rapidly rising house prices, you've got policy measures which are increasing the amount of transactions as well, and that's in producing considerably more money. I mean, it is striking, as you say, that the Scottish share is relatively volatile here. As you know, for most of the devolved tax forecasts we're doing, we're assuming that historic rates are of the Scottish share of total UK receipts continue into the future. Now, in some cases, like income tax, that's a reflection of the fact that the share doesn't move very much. For this one, it's a reflection of the fact that it does move quite a lot, but in ways that it's hard to explain. So why don't you average over some period and assume that will continue? So I think you have to take that into account. As for the issue of how you address the block grant under those circumstances, fortunately, that's way above my pay grade, and I will
I thought you would
leave it to the Cabinet Secretary and the Chief Secretary to fight that one out for themselves.
The Chief Secretary of Treasury also wants to maximise the revenue for the UK, and the Cabinet Secretary here wants to maximise it for Scotland. But the issue really about LBTT was obviously the OBR was about 14% out in terms of its predictions. It's quite a significant difference, and yet your most recent predictions are that revenue will be higher over the next 3 years than you'd even estimated in March 2012, when, as we saw, there was an overestimation of around 14%. I think that's why there gets some concerns.
That's part. I mean, the price story clearly has moved here. And one thing that we've done is to assume that there's a more, the increase in prices that we expect over the 5-year period, we're now assuming is more bunched into the near term rather than at the later point of that period, and that's a reflection of recent outturn data and the pace of what's happening in the most recent figures. So, certainly if you look back at where the forecast errors were in the total forecast for the last year, it was that the stamp duty receipts were more buoyant than anticipated, and given what's going on in the housing market, that's hardly surprising. There's of course a new and related issue about what will happen when Scotland moves from SDLT to the new tax. If it was difficult to forecast what was going to happen when you're sticking with the same system, it will become more difficult to forecast what's going to happen if there's a new system. So, we will obviously look forward to talking to whichever bit of Scottish Government or Revenue Scotland, etc., is thinking about what the rates and structure is going to deliver. Hopefully, I don't know whether, you may know this better than I, whether that's all going to be in place for us to be able to look at it in time for the autumn statement forecast at the end of this year, or whether that's more likely to push into the early part of next year. I will obviously talk to the experts here who are putting this together when they are in a position to talk to us about it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to open up the session to colleagues around the table. First person to ask questions will be Malcolm, to be followed by Jamie.
If I could start with the Scottish tax forecast, we're obviously very interested in those, particularly in terms of the income tax one, I think particularly if we go down a further fiscal devolution route. I mean, you explained some of that to the convener. I mean, I was interested in the effect of the budget when I was reading your paper, although you seem to suggest it wasn't as great as perhaps I was expecting from your text. But I mean, looking at your table 1.2 on page 5, Scottish share of income tax, I mean, does the effect of the budget have any, well, it doesn't seem to have any effect on Scottish share of income tax, or does it have an effect which is balanced out by something else kind of thing?
I mean, the main effect there is the new information on where we were back in 2011-12, because we now have the next round of the survey of personal incomes, which gives you the outturn data there, and that was suggesting that it was 3.08 rather than 3.03.
So why does it drop over 2 years to 2.92? What would be the explanation of that?
That's partly because if you're expecting London prices to grow relatively rapidly compared to the rest of the country, you're getting more receipts from London and the South East relative to Scotland.
But that's flattening out over the following 5 years. So
yes, I mean we're basically assuming that either the London or expensive house price effect will last for a while, but we're not assuming that you see an ever-continuing widening in the gap between the two. History suggests that over time you do get some regions some bits of the housing market leading others, and then in the longer term you make a more neutral assumption both about house prices in aggregate probably rising more in line with earnings, and assuming that we're not adding in something specific to the share to adjust for a continued change in relative housing market performance. But that's obviously something that you have to look at each time we have new data.
And in terms of share of income tax, there's no discernible effect of the budget on the Scottish share in that table at all.
On the income tax specifically, if you look at, where are we? Table.
I was actually asking about income tax before. I was kind of a bit mystified.
Okay, sorry. If you look at table 1.4, that shows you, if you've got this document, that shows you what's driven the change in income tax forecast. It says since March. It actually should be said since December. You can see the budget measures there, line second from the bottom. It's not trivial, but it's not enormous either. Towards the end, the dominant effect is, announcements of a further increase in the personal allowance, which has a direct effect there, both in terms of the cash implications, but would also have an effect on the Scottish share. The top line of that change is essentially taking into account the fact that the share in 2011-12 in outturn data was higher than we'd anticipated. So you basically take that on board and push that through the rest of the forecast, so it affects every year thereafter by roughly the same amount. We've taken into account an adjustment on the treatment of gift aid repayments, and as you see on the bottom line, that's basically the UK forecast as distinct from anything Scottish specific. And so the fact that we've had relatively strong data in the near past is pushing that higher. So you've got a combination of all these measures, of all these implications coming together. But the budget measures are, as I say, non-trivial. 30 million out of 5.6 billion is not enormous.
So in terms of block grant adjustments, the budget measures will always be able to be taken into account in terms of that.
Well, as I say, it's not for us to decide what a block grant adjustment is. We try to be as transparent.
But in principle, though.
Yeah, in principle, what we try to do with each forecast we do is to do this sort of diagnostic, which would allow you to look at the effects of these and whether the negotiators wish to take that into account.
And in terms of the actual income tax base, have we got information about that and how that's moving? Because of the relevant income tax base for the block grant adjustment, the non-savings, non-dividend, have we got any information about that and how that's changing?
What we've taken into account here, I'm not sure that I don't think there's anything particularly strange going on in the difference between the total income tax base and that specific one that pushes the figures dramatically. But we've tried to spell out as best we can. It's basically for that one, it's an issue of what HMRC can do for us in terms of removing the bits that are not included in that. So you're getting rid of some of the uncertainty that's in the self-assessment.
So just going back to the wider UK issues that you've discussed. I take your basic point is people drawing down savings at cyclical growth. You did mention picking up in business investment, but somewhere else you talk about the persistence of a low level of investment. So, what's your general view about that and whether it is picking up or not?
Well, the level is indeed low, and the Office for National Statistics has revised down the level, so it has looked weaker than earlier vintages of data have suggested. However, the latest data also suggests that there has been a relatively rapid pickup through 2013, about 8.5% increase from the beginning of the year to the end, not year on year compared to year. Now, obviously, there's the fact that there's been a pickup in business investment is one of the reasons why we've nudged the overall growth forecast slightly higher relative to December. But I was very careful in this document to point out that, given the scale of the revisions, we shouldn't be counting this particular bunch of chickens before they're hatched. And if you look at the scale of the revisions, you probably want to wait and see that this is really a sustained pickup rather than another branch in what is a relatively volatile path. But such as it is, it's relatively upbeat news. And as I say, if you look at the Bank of England's forecasts, they would have business investment growing in, double digits for the next 3 years, 12, 13, 14%. We have sort of 8, 9, 10 or thereabouts. So we're within the range of outside forecasts, but I think it's not surprising that the range is relatively wide when you're dealing with a series that is extremely volatile from quarter to quarter and also revised quite significantly from one vintage of data to the next.
And finally, can I just look at two of the factors you mentioned with reference to 2018? One was obviously there'll be more on debt interest, but you also talk about two scenarios where interest rates are even higher than assumed. I mean, how significant would those be in terms of the effect on the fiscal position?
Well, they have a different effect, and it's the reason for putting those scenarios in is obviously there's been a lot of debate about how quickly interest rates are going to rise and whether it might happen more rapidly than people were anticipating. The key point from the fiscal position is that it depends why interest rates are rising more rapidly. There's one explanation which you can think of as the good or the benign explanation, which is the reason interest rates are rising more rapidly is because the economy is doing better. So people's incomes and people's spending are rising more rapidly. Now that is beneficial in the sense that it will reduce the headline level of borrowing. It will make it perhaps more likely that the government will get the debt to GDP ratio falling again in 2015-16 as it hopes, but which we remain of the view that it's more likely than not that it won't achieve that. But it could do if you had a stronger economy, and one of the consequences of that being higher interest rates. What's less benign is if interest rates are rising, for example, because of risk premia and difficulties in emerging markets. In other words, if you have a rise in interest rates that is not accompanied by an increase in people's incomes. That's not as good for the fiscal position. If you assume it's telling you, more about the structural weakness of the economy, it might make things more difficult on the target to achieve cyclically adjusted balance. But of course, it also matters for individuals and families, because you would worry a lot less about people's ability to cope with rising interest rates if interest rates were rising because people's incomes are rising, than if interest rates were rising for a reason other than because people's incomes are rising. And so I'm sure that's one of the issues that, for example, the Financial Policy Committee will have an eye to in terms of where you need to worry more or less about this. But from our point of view, obviously we're focused more on the fiscal consequences.
And finally, if you could just talk us around it more on social security, because obviously the story about social security is very much some people being excluded from it, and presumably there'll be less unemployment in 2018. So is that demographics that's driving that, or is it other factors?
Well, in terms of the comparison with prior to the crisis, part of that, as I say, is because you've had a period in which the inflation rate to which the generosity of many welfare payments, social security payments is linked, has remained relatively high, even as the economy and the earnings of people in work has been relatively weak. That, as it were, pushes up the generosity of welfare payments in terms of the share of national income received per recipient. And so you certainly have all of the usual effects of, as there's a cyclical recovery, we see unemployment falling, that will reduce, welfare pressures. But you've also locked in, for example, a very substantial increase in the generosity of benefits when inflation was 5.2% in one particular September, and that was used for the subsequent years' increases. As I say, I'm using generosity here in a sort of relative sense. Obviously, there's a conceptual issue about whether you judge how generous these things are in terms of what you can buy with the benefit in question, or how generous it is relative to the living standards of people who are still in work. And one of the reasons that has evolved as it has is we've been through this relatively extended period when earnings have been weak relative to inflation. Retail price and consumer price inflation have been higher over the years since the financial crisis, even than Alistair Darling was expected when he produced his final forecast, which assumed there wouldn't be a recession. So it's this quite unusual period of having earnings very weak, the economy very weak, but retail price inflation remaining relatively high, partly because of imported costs and oil costs, etc.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Jamie, to be followed by Jean.
Thank you, Convener. I'm glad you quantified the term generous there, Mr Trump. I'm not sure many of my constituents at the sharp end of welfare reform would feel it's a particularly generous system, but that's more an observation, a question. Convener, you set out, you've talked about there being a degree of growth in the economy, but in your executive summary, you do say productivity remained disappointing, and I think I'm quoting you exactly from your opening statement. You said cuts to government spending are acting as a drag to recovery. Can you quantify this for us? Say that there hadn't been cuts to, you pick a certain area where there have been cuts. Say that hadn't happened. What might we have expected to see?
Well, there are two ways of looking at this. One of which is that there is a direct contribution from public spending to GDP, which you can look at in isolation. But that's only part of public spending. The bit of public spending that counts directly as part of GDP is basically the government's consumption of goods and services and the capital investment that it does, but not welfare payments, which are transferring money from one person to another person, but not increasing the total amount of output in the economy. So one thing you can do is look at how GDP is moving over time and saying what contribution has changes in government consumption of goods and services and government investment made. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. We produce tables showing the relative contributions of that compared to net exports, private consumption, etc. What's striking if you look at those data is that, ironically, over the period in which we and most other people have been over-optimistic about the overall growth of the economy, is that we've actually overestimated the extent to which public spending cuts would be a direct drag. And that is because we didn't take adequate account early enough of the way in which the output of much of the public sector is measured for the purposes of the national accounts. So what you've seen, for example, if you squeeze the amount of spending on teaching on schools, and you measure the output of schools by number of pupils passing through the school system, maybe adjusted for exam results, maybe not, then you can cut spending quite a lot and say remove teaching assistants, and it doesn't change that measure of output. So there's actually less of a drag than you anticipate, and it looks as though productivity is doing very well in the public sector specifically. If you announced, decided you were going to have cuts in education spending, and you said the way we're going to do this is by keeping the level of spending per pupil the same, but we're not going to educate anybody whose name ends after R in the alphabet, you would have a direct link between the cut in spending and the cut in the measured output from here. So in education, in a variety of areas of public services where a significant portion of the output is directly measured, we overestimated the degree to which this will be a drag on GDP in the early years. We now anticipate as you go further on that it will be a drag, but we've been surprised by how that little as that's happened before. So that's one issue, and you can quantify it in that way. There's then a broader discussion about what impact do you think fiscal consolidation as a whole has had on GDP, i.e. what is the consequence not only of the direct contribution in terms of what the government consumes and invests, but also the impact of the decisions it makes on welfare and the impact it makes on taxes and well. There you get into a debate over things called the multipliers, which is what is the effect on GDP of a given change in the amount of government borrowing you do, and that will differ depending on whether you produce the cuts through capital spending or welfare or VAT increases or other tax increases. The analysis we've done there is basically, if you go back to the forecast produced by my predecessor in June 2010, when the coalition came in and announced the first, really the only significant net near-term fiscal tightening relative to what they had inherited, there were a set of multipliers that they used at the time based on what is a fairly wide range of academic estimates, and they plucked some numbers that were within that range. If you apply those mechanically, you would say that the fiscal consolidation has probably taken about 1.7% off the level of GDP, i.e. the level of GDP will be about 1.7% higher in the absence of of that. And that's just directly applying those numbers. So that would have been having a negative impact on growth over the last few years. Looking forward, less of an impact on growth because you start to get to the point at which the depressing effect of the new year of fiscal consolidation is offset by previous years of fiscal consolidation fading away, and you know, basically the same amount of water is going in the bath from the tap as is coming out through the plug, and the level is remains constant overall. So that's as best as we've managed to quantify it in terms of the mechanical application of those multipliers that we used back in June 2010. There is, though, a broader debate, though, about, you know, those multipliers may be a good measure of what the impact on the economy is of doing a little bit more fiscal consolidation or a little bit less. But there's a much broader uncertainty about the fact that, you know, markets respond to fiscal consolidations in a non-linear way, i.e. there may be a point at which they get suddenly very nervous if you don't do very much at all, and that can have more dramatic effects. So I wouldn't place an enormous amount of weight, but we do quantify it, and we have a report in October that looks back to the performance of previous forecasts where we set all this out, and there is a quantified estimate. The level effect is about 1.7%, but as I say, I would, you know, treat that with a reasonable amount of salt, as you always have to do with these estimates.
Treating it with a reasonable amount of salt, you say 1.7% of GDP. What would that be in cash terms, roughly?
Well,
maybe I should bring a calculator.
Well, if you take roughly sort of 1,500 billion, 1,600 billion multiplied by 0.017.
I should have brought a calculator.
I haven't got a calculator with me, but I'm sure somebody can knock it up for you.
In terms of a comparison with other comparable economies, though, in terms of the UK position now, as opposed to before the financial crisis of 2008, how is it doing by comparison with other comparable economies?
In terms of the economy or in terms of the public finances?
In terms of the recovery, in terms of GDP?
It's been a relatively, I mean, what I think has been striking, you can see this comparison by comparison with past recessions in the UK as well as internationally, is that the peak to trough fall in the recession was, you know, big, but not, you know, without historical precedent. If you look over the previous 3 or 4 recessions, what has been striking is the weakness of the recovery subsequently. The fact that you've not seen a V-shaped pattern of recovering the lost ground, which the convener was talking about to begin with. So I think both internationally and in terms of comparisons with past history, that's what's striking, is the extended weakness of the recovery. Now, as I say, we need to be careful, bearing in mind what happened to the numbers in the 1990s, as to whether, when we all, as we doubtless will, meet here in 10 years' time, the history has been rewritten sufficiently to suggest that is still the pattern. But for the time being, as I say, it's the weakness after the trough that's striking at least as much, if not more, than the peak to trough decline.
I admire your confidence. We'll all be here in 10 years' time. I was given to understand that the UK's recovery was the weakest of all the G7 countries. Is that correct?
I don't have the comparison on me, but I think that would certainly fit with that. As I say, I wouldn't necessarily say it's the peak to trough fall that looks as dramatic, but, you know, where we are X years after the peak is a less flattering comparison for that reason.
The Treasury published a report alongside the budget impact on households, a distributional analysis to accompany budget 2014, and they say, and this is the Treasury's own figures, they say the accumulation of cuts to public services benefit forms and tax changes implemented between 2010-11 and 2015-16 mean that cuts will be equivalent to £757 for the average household, 2.1% of income, and for households in the bottom income quintile, cuts are equal to £1,814, 3.4% of income. Does that sound about right to you? I mean, obviously the concern here would be that this is the Treasury's own analysis of its own budget, but does that sound roughly correct to you?
I'm afraid the Westminster Parliament has told us explicitly this is outside our remit. Okay. With my previous hat on, I would have given you a formed answer to that, and I'm sure Paul Johnson would give you one if you asked him.
Okay. we'll maybe ask him then. Okay, you say wage growth, and that you've touched on this with the community mentioned the IFS position that real income levels won't return to 2001 levels until 2017-18. You said that sounded about right. So when you said wage growth remain disappointing, was that what you were referring to, or you referring to something else? Can you quantify what you meant here?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, in terms of disappointing, it's disappointing relative to the expectations of previous forecasts. I mean, what we've tended to find, you know, and we've tried to adjust for this in subsequent forecasts, is that relative to what we'd anticipated previously, employment tends to perform better than we expect, while wage growth doesn't pick up as much, and that's linked to the productivity puzzle. So, I mean, it's interesting, obviously, in terms of its fiscal implications, that has offsetting effects, because the total amount of labour income is boosted by employment, but weakened by relatively weak earnings growth. Generally speaking, you get more bang for your buck in terms of tax receipts from people's earnings growing than from the number of people in employment growing, because when the number of people in employment grows, many of those will be on relatively low incomes and not producing a great deal more tax, whereas if everybody's earnings are growing more rapidly, as we discussed earlier, you're helping to shove some relatively well-off people further up the tax bracket. So that's been a fairly consistent pattern. It'll be interesting to see when we come back to the next forecast whether that remains the case. Certainly the data we've had so far this year continues to show employment and unemployment similarly performing strongly relative, I think, to most people's expectations. And
not only would it help tax receipts, it presumably helps economic recovery as well. These people would have more money to spend productively in the economy.
Well, absolutely, and I think, you know, we've underlined the fact that in terms of getting to a long-term sustainable recovery, getting to a position in which productivity growth is such that you're able to see you know, people's real living standards rising. You're seeing incomes outstripping inflation by a healthy margin over a continuous period of time is very important to getting a long-term sustainable pickup in consumption, and consumption is the largest chunk of spending in the economy. So it's why, as I say, we've been slightly cautious about the pace of the pickup, of the sudden pickup in growth that you saw during 2013, to the degree that private consumer spending has contributed to that. It does seem to be more down to a reduction in saving than it does to the long-awaited pickup in real incomes. And, you know, the saving ratio, I think, fell by about 2 percentage points, or 2% of real household disposable income during 2013, and it's not realistic to expect that it continues to fall by 2 percentage points in the near term. You're going to need to see, you know, income growth picking up the reins. And so the reason why we have a slight slowing in growth during the course of this year in the forecast is because we're assuming that you move back to consumption being driven more by underlying income growth than by saving behaviour. That said, the difference is not enormous, and we will wait to see how the quarterly, you know, forecasting quarterly growth paths over the near term is an art at least as much as a science, and we wait to see what emerges.
I mean, that 2% of income cut that you referred to, that presumably was the same one I just referred to a second ago, which I know you can't comment on in detail, but it's interesting there because my question was about wage growth, and I'm not clear that that is covered by that 2% figure, because that refers to cuts to public services benefit reforms and tax changes. So, you know, these people could be, their situation could be further exacerbated by the failure for wage growth to really kick off.
Yeah, and I think, as I say, I mean, one way to take a step back from this is to return to the fact that GDP per head is going to take a lot longer to recover to its pre-crisis levels than GDP in total, because of what's happened to the population over that period. So it's not entirely surprising to see real incomes, you know, still some way away from their pre-crisis peak as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamie. Jean, to be followed by John.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener. In your opening statement, you talked only briefly about no growth in net exports. And I just wonder if that's for the period of the forecast, given that we see a growth in net exports in Scotland. And I appreciate that you don't have a differential of figures, but what makes you draw this conclusion?
It's a combination of the views that you take about the growth of the world economy and world trade. And there, obviously, we're a relatively small body, so we don't do a complete bottom-up global forecast to drive export demand. We're looking, for example, at the numbers that would be produced by the IMF and the OECD for their world forecasts and their world trade forecasts. And we would, adjust those if we felt there was a powerful reason to do so. But we're not taking an unusual view of the progress of the world economy relative to what the international institutions would say. Another thing that we would note is that the UK's share of export share, market share, has been on a fairly steady downward decline, which we assume to continue at a somewhat slower pace than it has done in the recent past. Now, partly that's an automatic reflection of the fact that if you have a world economy which consisted of the UK and 2 other countries in the emerging markets, and those other 2 countries trade more with each other, the UK can be standing still, but our share of overall trade falls because, countries B and C are trading more with each other and increasing the overall magnitude. So you have to take some account of that. The Eurozone, clearly the picture is better than people were anticipating some while back, but, you're not seeing the Eurozone motoring away in the way that it would lead you perhaps to take a dramatically more positive view of that. The fall in the exchange rate didn't have result in a dramatic improvement in export performance, as some people might have anticipated. So for all of those reasons, our view basically is that you don't get much more of a net contribution looking forward, and it's basically down to a view you take of the world economy, where that leads you to world trade, where that leads you to UK export performance relative to market share. And then on the import side, you've obviously got a pick-up in consumer spending, a pick-up investment, which is bringing imports in as well. So you've got those 2 things balancing out and, roughly speaking, cancelling out.
And we don't have disaggregated figures for Scotland and England, Wales, Northern Ireland for that.
No, not as far as... Well, yes, I mean, certainly not in the... Not without not with a sufficiently short lag for them to be terribly useful, I think would be the case.
Okay. It's going to be a kind of tough question, but with policy changes like the sale of the post office and the change in policy on pensions, are you aware of that in advance? Are you privy to that kind of policy change that might happen, and do you offer your own budget projections on these, or do you recalibrate figures after the event?
No, basically what happens is, because we're producing a forecast that is published as the Chancellor sits down after giving his budget statement, and I do a press conference on it, 2 or 3 hours later. So we have to have a forecast that incorporates the impact of all the measures that are going to be announced in any budget or autumn statement in real time. So the way that works is basically, if you go about 6 to 8 weeks prior to a budget or an autumn statement, we start producing forecasts on the basis of what will happen if the Chancellor does nothing and he just sits on his hands. So you have what's called a pre-measures forecast. And you produce a draft pre-measures forecast a few weeks, as I say, before each statement, and then you produce successive drafts of that as you take more of the judgments you need to take as more economic data comes in and you get closer to publication day. And we probably go through about 4 of those drafting rounds as we go along. Simultaneously, the Treasury will come to us again about 6 weeks prior to the budget and say, here is what they would call a draft scorecard, which is a list of measures that they are thinking of announcing in the course of the budget. And we look at that list, and you can see that, we can then work out which of these measures we're going to need to devote a lot of analytical effort to, which are going to be relatively simple to estimate their impact on both the economy and on the public finances. And as the same 6 to 8 weeks process goes on, and we're refining the pre-measures forecast, we can make inquiries. We talk to HMRC, for example, if it's a tax measure, and we see what we think is a sensible costing for each of these measures and what impact it's going to have during the course of the forecast period. Now, we know when we see the first list 6 weeks ahead that half the items on that list will never make it to the finishing line. Partly sometimes because the Treasury will think, oh, well, we want to do something on pensions. We've got 3 options, so we put the 3 down. And they're never going to want to do all 3, but it's basically a series of options. And then as you get closer to the budget, some things which weren't on the list at the beginning will appear on the list. And one of the important things that we have to do with the Treasury is to make sure that we're able to give adequate attention to each of these measures in order for us to be able to say we've had enough time and enough information to reach a judgment on whether these things are going to cost what the Treasury says they're going to cost. And as you'll appreciate, we have a debate about that. We will suggest things like, we think the avoidance of this tax measure will be greater than you're currently assuming. They can then decide whether they want to take that advice on board or not. As it turns out, there's never been an occasion in which the Treasury has gone to Parliament with an estimate of what a particular measure will cost or raise that we have felt constrained to say we just don't believe this. So that tells you something about their responsiveness during the course of this discussion and scrutiny process. But at the end of the day, we have to say, with every number that the Treasury puts into its list of policy measures and how much they're going to raise, yes, we agree, no, we don't, or you didn't give us enough time or information to reach an informed judgment. And so far, the vast majority of measures, the Treasury has responded to our suggestions that this may cost or raise more or less, and has taken those on board and has come out with a number that at the end of the day we've been happy to endorse. So short answer is yes, we do see these things in advance. We have to in order to produce a forecast that works on the day. We give advice to the extent that we say this is what we think this will cost or raise. We don't give advice of the sort this is an extremely stupid policy, or this is an excellent policy, or why don't you do something else instead. It's more limited to, if you go ahead with this, this is what we think it'll cost or raise.
And just on these 2 policy changes on the post office and pensions, do you think there are any unforeseen consequences then that weren't considered?
Well, in every policy measure, there's normally unforeseen consequences, and one of the difficulties is that the number of measures for which you have the time, information and opportunity to do a rigorous analysis after the event of whether it raised or cost what you thought it did is relatively limited. Normally, the occasions on which you do that are when you have a new policy measure in a subsequent budget or autumn statement, which is in a very similar area to something that's happened previously. And in order to have an informed view on what this one will raise or cost, you need to go back and really scrutinise what the previous one has done or not. I think one issue that, was striking with this budget and a number of measures, pension measure, bringing forward the amount of money people have to pay up front in disputes over tax avoidance, etc., is that some of the measures, there's about 4 measures that taken in aggregate are quite positive for the public finances during the 5 years of our forecast horizon, but are much less positive if you were to push the horizon further into the future. So we felt for those ones it was particularly important to present what the forecast would look like over a 20 to 30 year time horizon, because we felt that just focusing on what they were expected to raise or cost in the near-term 5 years was giving an unduly flattering impression of their underlying impact on the public finances, and we wanted to show that the 1.2 billion a year these things were raising over the first 5 years would pretty much dribble away fairly quickly beyond the 5 years. So that, I think, gives a fairer impression of the impact. So you have to be particularly wary of measures that shift money from later to earlier or from earlier to later, as distinct from measures that just basically raise the same amount of money or cost the same amount of money each year into the future, because that can paint an unflattering or a unduly flattering picture.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. John, followed by Gavin.
Thank you, Convener. I mean, you were just touching there on the question of savings, and you mentioned that too when you were speaking to Mr Gibson and Mr Hepburn. I mean, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that people are actually saving less at the moment. It's not that they're actually eating into their savings as such.
It's basically, there's an aggregate number for the saving ratio, which is incorporating some people taking on more debt, some people saving less. So there's we don't look at it as that much of a micro level, but in aggregate, the share of people's incomes that they are saving has fallen over that period.
Right, and with the changes in the pensions, that would encourage people to spend perhaps earlier and then not spend later, which is kind of what you were just saying, I think, just now in answer to Jean Urquhart, that that would be a movement in spending rather than an overall increase.
Yes, I mean, there's a series of measures, for example, on the changes on annuities, ISA, treatment of ISAs, tax-free accounts, a new granny bond in effect, a set of changes that are likely to have influences on saving behaviour. What we felt was sensible to do there was to look at these in aggregate. And basically what we decided at the end of the day was that we weren't going to adjust the economic forecast for the effect of these things in aggregate, not because we are certain that they will not have an impact, but because some of them go in one direction, some of them go in the other direction, and one can't even be clear as to what the aggregate sign is likely to be. So we basically looked at them in the round and said that we didn't feel it was sensible to make an additional adjustment to the forecast on that basis. So if you take the annuity issue, and obviously that is something which will encourage people to spend money earlier, but maybe it will also encourage other people, well, actually, I'm going to now save more in the first place because I'm going to be less concerned about it being tied up in the future. So you have, even on one measure, things going in both directions. You would expect, again, with the annuity measure, that will have different effects on the incentives of different sorts of people. It's likely to be relatively attractive to bring forward money for people who've got expensive debts that they'd like to be able to pay down and save money on. It might also be relatively attractive to people who've got relatively large amounts of assets. It's less likely to be attractive for the people in the middle of those two groups. We're assuming that roughly 30% of people will, as it were, take their money earlier as a consequence of the annuity decision taken in aggregate. So with those sorts of measures, it's best to look at them in the round and to try to reach a judgment on that. And as I say, looking at in the round, you have things moving in both directions. And so we haven't made a further adjustment to, for example, our saving ratio forecast compared to the pre-measures forecast that I was mentioning with Ms. Urquhart, on the basis of those things, because they're going in different directions.
Yeah, so I mean, some people have suggested that, well, people were hit in 2010 and realised they hadn't been saving enough, and so people's behaviour might change going forward. But from your perspective, you wouldn't make a judgment on that. Would you just wait and see what actually happened? Well,
we haven't made we haven't made a judgment on that. We've identified it in the policy costings document as one of the key areas of uncertainty around this package of fiscal measures in this budget, is the fact that you've got quite large measures affecting the incentives people have to save, and to save in particular sorts of ways, and that the unforeseen consequences of that might be considerable, but ex ante it doesn't look as though you can say we are confident that it's going to be of X amount in one direction or another. But I mean, it is striking. There's an awful lot of savings floating around, and people can move money in quite large volumes quite quickly, as we noted in this report, for example, between deposit accounts and site access accounts. You see billions of pounds moving relatively rapidly there, and so it remains to be seen what impact this set of measures is going to have. A lot can depend, for example, on whether you suddenly discover all the Sunday newspaper personal finance sections are saying of a particular measure, this is great, fill your boots, or whether they're not, and that can have quite an impact on the eventual impact.
And I mean, thinking about changing behaviour on house prices, and well, both house prices and, as we discussed earlier, the volume of house sales, you mentioned in there long-term trends. So presumably, again, the assumption is that, you know, people's behaviour in relation to houses, either how often they buy or what kind of prices they pay, is not changing, even though we thought that people were paying too much for houses.
Yes, I mean, we don't reach a view on what is the right level of house prices and have a model that, you know, that is, you know, very heavily deterministic in moving to that. You have some things where you basically on the right level of housing transactions. So on transactions, we basically assume that in the long term you return to people moving house with roughly the frequency that they had done over a longer period. And if you're way, way below that level, then you can have quite rapid growth in housing transactions to get you back to that normal level. But needless to say, there is considerable uncertainty about what the eventual normal level is going to be, and whether history is as good a guide to that as you hope it will be. But you know, you need to take into account the information you have available.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's a good phrase, the information we have available, because you mentioned the changes that the ONS are making, and I'm not sure, I mean, I realise that you're obviously not the ONS, but I don't have a particularly good handle on the changes that they are making. I mean, if I'm reading, I think it's 1.39 on page 16 correctly, you know, make some changes in one direction, again, some changes in the other direction. So overall, is there not really much impact? But how will it affect us if we're trying to compare different years?
The key things, I mean, you've got some effects which are directly affecting, in particular, the size of the public sector's debt. There are some effects on the deficit, but they're of less important magnitude. So some things that previously weren't being counted as public sector debt will be. And as a consequence, we expect that to add about £140 billion to the measured size of public sector debt in 2014-15.
I mean, that's a wee bit scary that suddenly debt appears out of nowhere.
It is, but it's important to bear in mind that, you know, nothing in reality has changed. The way we measure it has changed. So, for example, the treatment of whether you regard Network Rail as being part of the private sector or the public sector has an impact on that.
And then do we go back and change the last 20 years to compensate for that? Or?
That's right. So what we will be urging ONS to do is to give us the longest possible run of data on a consistent basis that allows you to draw this inference. Now, in terms of the year-to-year changes, as best we can estimate, the addition to net debt in 2018-19 will be slightly smaller than 140 billion. So you're in a position where the level of net debt is higher, but higher by smaller amounts in the future than near term. So it makes the probability of debt falling in any given year slightly higher than it previously was, although the level is going to be higher already. Now, the second complication is that when people look at government debt, they normally look at debt as a share of national income, not simply in cash terms. And at the same time as increasing the measure of public sector debt by, for example, changing the treatment of Network Rail, the government, the ONS, will be making another set of changes that will increase the cash size of the economy. For example, investment that companies do, intangible investment, more of that will be counted as an output rather than as an intermediate function that gets washed out in the public finances. So the overall cash size of the economy will be higher. So you have a higher level of debt, you have a higher level size of the cash economy, and those have offsetting effects on debt as a share of GDP. So basically, the cash numbers push it up, the increase in the cash size of the economy pulls it down, but not by enough to get you back to where you started with. So the net debt ratio as a share of GDP is likely to look higher when we meet again next than it does today, looking back as well as looking forward.
It's quite interesting. We should maybe get the ONS along to the committee sometime and
If you are keen, there's an annex in the reports, which I suspect that the clerk has very helpfully not inflicted on you. It's of a niche interest, I would describe, but it does go through in some detail exactly what the contributors are to the change in net debt for those people, relatively small and noble band who are interested in these sorts of things.
Right, well, that's helpful, thank you. I mean, it talks onto SDLT and land and buildings transaction tax. You talk about forecasting land and buildings transaction tax going forward once you know what the rates and the bands and things will be. I mean, can you just clarify why you would be forecasting for LBTT? Because that would be on behalf of the Scottish Government, but you're not directly working for them?
True, no, but we will still need to take a view on that because we're having to come up with an aggregate forecast for the public sector finances for the UK as a whole. What we will want to do is to talk to whoever is producing the forecasts for, as I say, you may know the answer to this question, whether it's the Scottish Government, Revenue Scotland, or whether the possible new independent body will be doing this. Whoever is doing it, we will look forward to talking to them about whatever numbers they've come up with. If we feel it's necessary, we may want to adjust those for the numbers that we put into our data, but we will still need to cover that in order to produce a comprehensive view of the public finances. But we'll obviously want to talk to whoever's doing whoever's turning the handle in Scotland on this, in the same way that we talk to HMRC about every other tax that we're looking at. And obviously, in terms of SRIT, we can obviously continue to talk to HMRC about that. But in the fully devolved taxes, we'll obviously want to talk to whoever the experts are in terms of the people who are designing this, working out what they think they're going to raise from whatever rates and rules they put in place, and we'll either take those numbers or adjust them as we see fit.
So in the short term, you would be forecasting both what SDLT would have been if we'd kept a Scottish share, and also what LBTT we expect it to be, because the two might be different.
Yes, at the end of the day, to produce a forecast for the UK public finances, we need the forecast of the receipts from whatever tax is the tax that actually is being paid at the time. So if we know that SDLT is going to fall out at, for 2015 and thereafter, you have a new and different structure. To produce a forecast for the public finances that will go forward to next time 2019-20, we obviously need to be forecasting on the basis of the tax that will be in place.
Yes. Whereas the other purpose of your forecast would be to inform the block grant adjustment, which is based not on LBTT but on SDLT going forward. So exactly, you need that one as well.
Exactly.
And I think the final point I had was, I noticed it said that in the final week before the budget, HMRC officials provided you with a final set of Scottish forecasts, etc. Due to confidentiality of the measures, we were unable to involve the Scottish Government in this stage of the process. Could you just explain why that was the case?
Yes, basically the pre-measures forecast is on the basis of whatever the policy is prior to the budget. And we can and do have the Scottish Government representatives in the discussions when we're saying, how do we think these things are likely to evolve? How do we interpret the past information? But what obviously we can't do is share with the Scottish Government what the Chancellor is planning to announce to the UK Parliament in the budget before he's announced it.
I'm just wondering how that will work going forward. I mean, assuming we are still part of the UK. But I mean, say there was some dramatic change in landfill tax at the UK level in the UK budget. Would that not need to be discussed with the Scottish Government?
Well,
would that not be you, but somebody else should do that?
Well, there's a different issue as to whether, yes, but I think it would be unlikely that the UK government or that the Chancellor would discuss measures that he's thinking of announcing in a budget prior to him announcing them to Parliament. You can have consultations over changes of this sort, but we basically have to produce a forecast on the basis of unchanged policy and then try to take into account what the Chancellor is going to announce on budget day, which he's going to keep to himself.
But you would also, obviously the UK system's different because we do consult in our budget before we kind of get there, but I mean, you would then have to try and forecast what the Scottish Government might do in response to what the UK Government has done, which strikes me as almost impossible for you if you haven't spoken to the Scottish Government.
Well, I think on that basis, we would have to work on the assumption of unchanged policy until we know. I think you'd probably have to sweep that up in a subsequent forecast. If a change in UK policy stimulated a change in Scottish policy after the event, in a way that wasn't sort of predetermined, you'd have to catch up with that after the event. I don't think it would be appropriate for us to produce a forecast on the basis of, we are required by Parliament to produce a forecast on the basis of current policy. And it would be, I think, inappropriate for us to guess how the Scottish Government would change policy in response to a change in UK government policy.
Yeah, it's an interesting area because, I mean, certainly with income tax, if we're having control over the 10%, I can see the Scottish Government might well react, and depending on what has happened elsewhere.
If the UK change, if
yes.
the other parameters, if the UK cut or raised rates, then would the...
Right, yes.
Well, I think there again, I suspect we would not be very popular if we prejudged how the Scottish Government was likely to set its income tax.
Well, it's maybe a requirement for the two governments to talk to each other rather than...
Yes. And again, there, obviously, there's a question over what timescale, and if this is all, done in a way that is consistent with having an agreed view at the time of the budget, then we would be able to take that on board. I presume that's not where we're going to end up. The other issue, of course, is that in terms of when decisions are made on the Scottish rate, we have to produce our forecasts for the timetable for the UK budget and autumn statement. So again, I guess there are questions about when it is clear what the Scottish rate is going to be and in which forecasts we're able to incorporate that as existing policy, or quite how the relative timetables are going to work out.
Yes, because you made the point earlier that if you do give more notice of changes, that can allow certain taxpayers to start moving their affairs around to accommodate that, doesn't it?
Oh, well, yes, that's a slightly different issue. Is if you have a tax change and you announce it in advance, that always creates, depending on the nature of the tax, that creates the potential for people to anticipate what's being done. Now,
which is why all governments tend not to want to announce it.
I suspect, there's rather more scope for that with self-assessed income tax than there is in landfill. Yes. But, there are some areas of tax where pre-announcing something is clearly, if you have changes in capital gains tax, which create a powerful incentive for people to realise gains at one point in time rather than another, for example, then that's something that people have to be wary of. And it's one of the things, as I say, that's made forecasting income tax particularly complicated over the last few years. Not merely that the rates have moved up and down, but that the announcement, that the movements have been announced some way in advance, and they are tax changes that affect people who are in a relatively easy position in terms of shifting their income from one point to another than wage slaves like ourselves.
Okay, thanks so much.
Okay, Gavin, to be followed by Michael.
Thank you. First question, just a brief one on business investment. Has anything happened since you published your fiscal and economic outlook to make you more optimistic or less optimistic about your projections for business investment?
There's nothing. I mean, we won't come back to this and do another forecast until we get to the autumn statement. So, as I say, I think, given the amount of data revision that we've got coming up over the next few months, I think trying to worry too much about this in the near term when so much could change before we get to the next forecast wouldn't be worthwhile. But no, there's nothing that I could point to that would suggest anything very different at this stage, but I wouldn't want to suggest that we've been looking very closely at it to reach those conclusions either.
Okay, thank you. Right, can I move on to an issue that hasn't been touched on yet this morning? It's page 111 of your economic and fiscal outlook, paragraph 4.52, headlined UK oil and gas revenues. Now, I'll be slightly sensitive to how I ask this question, but can you just outline to the committee how you reached your conclusions that for 13-14 it would be 4.7 billion, for 14-15 it would be 3.7 billion, so on and so forth, up to 18-19, where you're predicting 3.5 billion. Can you just outline to the committee the process that the OBR goes through in order to reach those conclusions?
Yes, I mean, one of the delights of forecasting oil and gas revenues is that there are so many determinants that go into it that move around quite a lot, which means that the receipts here are very volatile. Changes of 40 to 70%, from one year to the next are not unusual, and that you end up, with forecasts being revised significantly. And the reason for that is, as I say, that you have a number of variables that you need to take into account. One of which is obviously production. The second one is price. Because the price is set in dollars, you have to worry about the sterling dollar exchange rate. You also have to worry about the level of expenditure that's going into the industry, because that can be set off against tax, quite a lot of it, and therefore, doing more capex reduces the amount of receipts you get in. And then you have, any changes in the tax system that there are at the same time. So, in order to come up with a forecast, you basically need to look at all those things. So, in terms of production, we obviously look at the data that's available and the projections that are available from DEC, OGUK, and broadly the picture there is that we have been repeatedly over-optimistic in assuming that the fall in oil production was going to level off, and it hasn't. It has continued to decline. That said, we continue to assume that, having fallen for 13 years on the trot, that we are going to see a period in which production stabilises, and that's a reflection of the amount of investment that's going on in the industry, and we're assuming that that is sufficient to arrest the decline in production. As I say, we've tended to assume that that was going to happen before. If you look at the Department of Energy and Climate Change's production forecast year after year, they've assumed that the pace of decline in production is going to slow down or stop, and it never does. It continues to go. So we're hoping that at some point the trend will cease to be the friend, and we'll actually see the flattening off that we're expecting. You then have to take a view on prices. There we used to use the futures curve right the way out over 5 years. We got concerned about that because the trading is very, very thin once you get beyond the first couple of years, and it's not clear whether you're getting sensible information. So we're using futures and basically therefore assuming flat thereafter. There are a variety of other more or less complicated assumptions you can make, but that's it's a good trade-off, I think, between simplicity and taking on board the information that's in the market to begin with. As you'll be aware, there are numerous different ways of doing this that different organisations do, and some have higher oil price forecasts over the next 5 years than we do, and some have lower ones. We make an assumption about movement on the exchange rate based on relative expectations, relative interest rates, etc. In terms of capital expenditure, again, we look at the information, the intelligence we can get from DEC and from the industry in terms of what, the industry via DEC, in terms of what's going on with CapEx, for example, and other expenditure. And that, in terms of the sort of weakness of receipts looking forward, you have a twin thing, is that the relatively large amount of investment that is going on in the industry, we hope, perhaps against recent experience, that this will arrest the decline in production that we've seen. But at the same time, if you're doing a lot of investment, the firms are able to set that off against tax, and therefore you don't get the receipts early on. You'll get more receipts later on as a consequence of the higher production, but it'll be offset in the near term. So in coming up with all these numbers, you're basically looking at that set of determinants. And what we do, as you see in table 4.11, is that in each forecast we do, we try to split out how the aggregate forecast for receipts has changed as a result of each of these things. So you can see, oil and gas production hasn't had a great deal of impact between December and March, which is hardly surprising. You've only had 3 months. There's not a great deal more information there. If you'd done the comparison with a year ago, you'd obviously have been taking on board the fact that production had disappointed again. Then you've got market movements, prices, expenditure, less receipts coming in the near term as a result of expenditure, because if you're having more capital investment, more of that is possible to set off against tax. That affects the receipts. So that's basically the exercise that we have to go through. But it's one of those areas of receipts that you have a a relatively large number of determinants that are in themselves quite volatile and hard to predict, which is why, both in terms of the outturn and in terms of the forecasts, you get this moving around quite a lot. And I'm afraid that will be true of whoever tries to do you a forecast for these sorts of things, not just for us.
Okay, thank you. One of the criticisms made of the OBR is that you haven't taken into account the capital investment and expenditure made by oil companies going forward. I mean, to what extent have you taken that into account, or is the criticism accurate?
Well, it isn't. I mean, as I say, if you were to come down from Mars and look at the path of oil production over the last few years, you'll see it's a pretty straight downward line. And therefore, I suspect that the puzzled Martian would look at our expectation that oil production is now going to go flat over the next 5 years and say, well, why on earth are you expecting this decline that we've seen over the last, continuous decline we've seen over the last decade also not continuing? And the reason for that is precisely the increase in investment that you've described.
Okay. In terms of there's obviously two elements that we talked about, a number of elements. One is production levels, and one are then revenues that would flow from those production levels. Is the OBR judgment, based on whoever you've spoken to, that production is going to stabilise as opposed to increase?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. And as a consequence of that, your figures for the revenues that we collect are then shown in that table, 4.11.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Okay. Nothing more on that particular section. Just one finally, if I may, Convener, just back on to SDLT. You talked about it being a fairly volatile and unpredictable tax. Is there a difference in terms of volatility and unpredictability when you compare commercial versus residential? Because your projections seem to change less, I would say, on commercial than they do on residential. I just wonder if there's any obvious explanation for that.
Yeah, I think that's probably true, that the volatility has been somewhat less. Whether that has what the explanation for that would be, I don't know to what extent. It's obviously linked to mortgage availability, the relative generosity of, or rather the pricing and availability of mortgages, and whether that, moves in a way over time that generates a greater degree of uncertainty. I suspect in terms of businesses, in terms of the planning that they're doing, that might lead you to a less volatile outcome for the two. But yes, I'm afraid that's as close as I can get you.
Sure.
There may be other structural reasons for it.
Okay, thank you. Kevin, thank you.
Thanks, Gavin. Jamie, you want to come in with a supplementary?
Yeah, no, it's just in relation to the oil and gas stuff that Gavin's explored. I was intrigued by Mr. Trout's use of terminology. We talked about relatively high investment. My understanding was that the investment from 2013 was actually the highest that there has ever been. I mean, is that your understanding as well?
I think so, yes.
Okay. So when you say relatively high, we could actually say a record high instead of relatively. In terms of
most things in nominal terms are at record heights at most of the time.
Okay, well, in terms of the oil price, you would accept your position as fairly pessimistic by comparison to other assumptions, though you are at the pessimistic end in terms of.
I wouldn't have said
forecast.
So.
Well, DEC, you assume. In 2016-17, $99 a barrel, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think the last time I looked at the comparison, which I think was probably the last time here I gave a talk on this, we had a range, which I seem to remember that the Scottish Government produced a set of oil price assumptions, at which ours was at one end of the extreme, and some think tank here produced another set, and we were at the bottom end of that. And I think if you added the two together, we were somewhere in the middle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'm not talking about a think tank, but the Department of Energy and Climate Change assume $120 a barrel. The Scottish Government, by contrast, has been more cautious than that, more optimistic than you, but you are lower than many others.
Well, you have then a whole variety of other people, the IMF, the IEA, the OECD, Bank of Norway, take your pick.
And in terms of production, you assume flat production, but the industry itself, Oil and Gas UK, forecast an increase from 1.4 million barrels a day to 1.7 million barrels by 2017. So, why is the industry wrong and you're right?
Well, for the same reason that DEC has been wrong over time. I mean, if you look at the comparison in the past, things don't always turn out as the industry suggests, and they don't always turn out as DEC has suggested.
Or as the OBR suggest.
Well, as I say, I mean, the view we've taken is that given the scale of investment, you would expect to see the steady decline that we've had in the past levelling out. We've assumed that in the past, and we've been historically disappointed by the fact, as the industry has been and as DEC has been, that production has continued to decline rather than stabilising as people have anticipated for some time.
So your assumption is that the industry has invested a record amount of £14.4 billion, and your estimate is that will result in flat production, whereas they themselves who have invested this money project an increase, and they're wrong?
Well, if you look at what they were saying when they wrote to me a year or two ago, they said that there's a record amount of investment, and they were disappointed by the level of production.
Okay, Michael?
Thanks very much, Convener, and sort of going from the sublime to the ridiculous, talking about billions of pounds of income to talk about the aggregates levy, where we're talking about very marginal sums. But in your document, you suggest that over the next 4 years, aggregates production, the levy will increase by £4 million. So it is a very marginal figure. But interestingly, you said that that's because of a change in aggregate extraction, and that's what I'm really interested in. What is the change? What are you basing that assumption on? I mean, you're saying that there's been a decline, but what factors are impacting on that decline?
Well, again, here we're relying on the data that we can get from the relevant departments on this. So I'm not sure in terms of the magnitude of this one. I presume that this is more an extrapolation of recent trends informed by some view of the future rather than an assumption of a dramatic change in the path. But as you say, I'm afraid I'm not able to get into much more detail than that.
Yeah, just my understanding is that as a proportion of aggregate extraction, Scotland has got a higher percentage extraction, but overall you're predicting that the UK forecast will increase by 31 million over the same period, and Scotland by 4 million. That's almost exactly how you would expect it to be in terms of
the share remaining relatively constant, yes.
Yeah, so if Scotland does produce more in terms of aggregates, then it would appear that we're going to be producing less than the UK average over that period, and I just wondered if that's a right interpretation of the table.
Yes, well, I assume again that this is based on an assumption that the proportions are relatively constant. So certainly if you were in a situation where the Scottish level moved out of the path that the rest of the UK is moving, then you would see that shifting. But I can check this, but I think the assumption is that this is based on the share remaining relatively constant.
Yeah. You might not be able to answer this one either, but for as long as I've been looking at economic figures, there's been discussion around how valuable the use of GDP in terms of measuring the strength of a particular country and in comparing it with other countries. That's become quite topical again. It's one that's always there in terms of the debate amongst academics, economists, politicians, geeks, anoraks and whoever. But it is something that's come up recently. I just wondered if you would defend the use of GDP as the measure by which you forecast the strength of the economy.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. There are, and I think the issue here is horses for courses. What are you trying to predict it for? What we're trying to do ultimately is to predict the path of the public finances. So we're trying to look at where spending is going to go, where tax receipts and other receipts are going to go on the basis of existing policy. Now, when you consider that most taxes, for example, are levied on some proportion of people's incomes, people's spending, transactions in the economy, then the key variables we need to look at is less actually real GDP, which is the one that most, to the extent that people reading the newspapers are focusing on as, how well is the economy doing this quarter relative to the previous quarter, etc. That's actually less important to us than the size of the cash economy and how that breaks down into different categories of spending and different categories of receipts. So I would agree with you in the sense that there is probably more attention placed on our forecast for real GDP because most people are interested in that as some sort of index of how well the economy is doing, even though it's not in the top 5, 3 or 4 list of variables that if a fairy godmother came down and said you can predict this one with perfect certainty in order to help you to predict what's going to happen in the public finances, real GDP would not be at the top of the list. There's a related set of questions about whether you claim that GDP is a good measure of sort of material well-being. And there you run into questions of the fact that it doesn't take into account how income is distributed. It's an aggregate. It doesn't take into account the fact that, whether you regard producing, weaponry as being an addition to well-being or not, whether you take into account the environmental consequences, etc. I think all of those are not arguments for not looking at GDP. They're arguments for if you're asking a question to which the answer is not provided by that, look at something else. And the ONS, for example, has a big programme of work on well-being that they're producing alternative and additional indicators. And you can have a different debate about whether that's value for money in terms of whether it tells you anything new or interesting. But you can certainly point to the flaws in GDP for a variety of purposes, but that's not necessarily the purpose for which it was put there in the first place. I commend to you an excellent book by my former colleague at The Independent, Diane Coyle, slim volume, you'll be glad to hear, on GDP, An Affectionate Tribute, which looks both at why we should still care about it and why we shouldn't care about it too much.
Yeah. So when Professor John Kay raises doubts and politicians use it as the benchmark, we should tread carefully, is that?
I think you should do. As I say, it depends very much on what question they're claiming GDP gives you the answer to. Okay. And if it's not the right question, then you need to be wary. The other reason to be wary of it, as I say, on real GDP, I bring you back to the issue of revisions. That, the path of the fall and the recovery in GDP in the 1990s now looks completely different from what you anticipate, or what it appeared to be, even in retrospect, in the mid-1990s. So, you should have caveats for whether the official measure of GDP is even measuring what it's supposed to be measuring accurately, let alone whether it's measuring the right thing to answer whatever other questions you might want to answer. But, that's not an attack on the ONS. This is, it's, measuring, summarising activity in the economy of tens of millions of people is not a straightforward thing to do anyway. And the idea that there's some magic number that summarises everything that anybody wants to know about the economy is, I'm afraid, not on the table.
So when a government uses GDP as its benchmark, it should have a government warning attached?
Well, and the government has been supportive of this idea of the ONS doing more work on well-being, whether, how many people look at the work that's done on the well-being measures and whether this tells them a great deal that they couldn't have guessed otherwise or that you could have derived from other measures, I think is in the eye of the beholder.
Okay, thank you very much.
I just think it's a shame it's a couple of months past Valentine's Day. We could all got that GDP book for our other halves. I think the issue in GDP is that because it's
giving,
because it's internationally recognised, I think there'll be a lot of suspicion from whoever's in the opposition at the time if any government tries to shift away from it. I think that's one of the difficulties. It's certainly something we've discussed at the committee before. Now, we've concluded the questions from the committee. I just want to touch on one issue because it hasn't really come up from the committee. Actually, we've had quite a lot of questions on some of the kind of sexier issues, actually, such as the big macroeconomic issues. But I want to bring you back to, like Michael Wee's aggregate tax. I want to take you to landfill tax, and the issue on that, of course, is the importance, of course, is in terms of the impact on the block grant adjustment, of course, and that's why we've discussed on a number of occasions in this committee some of the OBR forecasts on that. Now, in March 2012, you predicted that in 2016-17 there'd be £157 million in receipts in Scotland. but your most recent prediction is of 100 million for the same year, which is a difference of more than 36%. However, although the Scottish Government estimates that landfill receipts will continue to fall to around 40 million by 2025, your forward projections appear to be almost in terms of stability in terms of the receipts, and you say as a result of stronger than expected UK landfill tax receipts. Is this something you're going to pay more? You're going to discuss more in greater detail with the Scottish Government, and if so, have they come back to you with what they think their annual long-term declines in those receipts will be?
They haven't come to us with any alternative numbers, and obviously in terms of the discussion of the pre-measures forecast, Scottish Government officials were present virtually, if not in the room, for that. I mean, if you look on pages 11 and 12 of the note, I mean, the main change in the forecast since last time was taking into account the better data on the landfill, the path of landfill charged at the standard rate from DEFRA, which I think maybe, I mean, you had concerns, I think the Scottish Government had concerns about whether policy was driving this down more rapidly than was in the forecast anyway. So the fact that DEFRA's numbers now suggest that there's more of that going on at a UK-wide level may address some of that anxiety. As I recall from the note that was the background note for this meeting, it referred to the Scottish Government, I think, saying that there was an expectation of 107 million in 15-16, but then a decline further on. Is that, if my memory serves me correctly? So their number didn't seem to be very different for 15-16, but obviously they were producing a forecast that goes way beyond our 5-year horizon.
40.5 million by 2025. I mean, the issue there is really that the predictions are that Scotland's share of landfill tax income appears to be, in terms of predictions, holding steady 8.9%, and we have a concern that just might be an exaggeration because of the policy of trying to go for more greener policies to actually reduce landfill.
It's clearly an uncertainty, but I mean, the Scottish Government hasn't come back to us with here is an alternative set of numbers that we think you ought to look at instead. I'm sure, whether, if you look at the chart 1.2, you obviously have a decline in landfill charged assumed for the UK as a whole, whether the relative expectations of both governments that landfill is going to go down, who's expecting more and how well founded those judgments is, I suspect, going to be rather difficult to reach a prior view on. But obviously, if there's any information that people want to bring to us to look at over this horizon, then we'd be pleased to look at it.
Okay, well, that's something we can pursue. Now, I'd like to thank you very much for your contributions today. I mean, you've been in the hot seat for nearly 2 hours, but I'm just wondering if there's anything you feel the committee hasn't touched on during its deliberations that you might want to
no, I don't think so. I think I obviously enjoyed our earlier discussion on the possibility of the independent fiscal institution for Scotland. I think from our point of view, looking over the next few months until we meet again, obviously the issue about where the forecasting expertise is going to reside in for the non-SRIT devolved taxes and is a matter of particular interest to us. I want to make sure that we're in a position that, however the Scottish Government decides to arrange these things, we can come up with, the best possible working relationship in terms of, respecting, if that's an independent body, respecting our relative independence, but also being able to exchange information and to be able to do this in the most straightforward process. And if there are different views taken, and these are things about which people are always going to take different views, I'd like to be in a position where we can have so we at least know why we're different, even if we decide to stick to those particular views. So I'd be very interested to see how the mechanics of that are going to unfold. I understood from your notes that most of that remains uncertain for the time being, but presumably it will clarify itself before we meet again. Yes,
we're waiting for the government to respond to the committee's report, which was submitted on the 7th of February. Well, thank you very much once again, Robert. Your contribution is very enlightening and greatly appreciated, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, particularly the first trip to St Andrews.
Thank you very much.
That being now the end of the public session in terms of the committee's deliberations, I'll now close the public part of the meeting to allow the official report, Mr Choate and guests to leave, and I'll call a recess of 10 minutes so that committee members can have a natural break and recharge the batteries.